Welcome to podcast number 6 of Yieldseekers. This week with Mark Westlink, Mark Soons, and Rowan Rosamond, myself. Mark Soons, known for the book Mr. Cashflow and his community. Mark Westlink is busy expanding his cooperative in the startup world. I also call him the Startup King, and myself, Rowan Rosamond, from the hedge funds and investment funds through fund structuring. Welcome this week. We're going to talk about all sorts of things, including Trump's tariffs war, where a lot is happening, and how China is responding to it. We're going to dive into how Europe is dealing with it, how Europe is actually changing the climate, and how the American political climate has changed. We're going to look at innovation, how people nowadays will be transported on a mountain goat if Kawasaki has its way. A lot is happening this week, so tune in, and today we'll discuss everything that's going on.
If you've ever seen a film by David Barlow about mountain climbing, they can really be in an impossible place, just leaning so steeply against the mountain. And this is it too. It's truly phenomenal.
Then you have to imagine that you can just go explore the land like that.
Yes, that would be a solution for me. Then I wouldn't have to say anymore, I'm the man with the red crutch, orange crutch, but I'm the man on the Kawasaki.
With that silver mountain out.
Yes, mountain goat.
Yes, but completely with screen and everything and headlights and you name it all.
However, nature is undoubtedly the most effective method. A mountain goat represents thousands of years of evolution, allowing it to navigate mountains through them and over them. They are capable of this, and we can certainly replicate this now. Indeed, Boston Robotics has demonstrated this every year. I'm unsure if you've ever watched a video from Boston Robotics, but from the past 25 years of progress in their appearance. Yes, fantastic.
But when you see that first robot, it kind of falls over, doesn't do what it's supposed to, and then
Yeah, a bit wobbly.
now suddenly, just a double flip. Yes, okay, standing up. When we see people doing that, we think, wow, top sport, that should go to the Olympics, and now robots do it effortlessly. That's absurd.
This is absurd. And of course, the energy supply always remains a little issue. I don't mean how long the Kawasaki can walk around, because I don't think it's desirable for you to really be in the middle of nowhere will you find yourself with a Kawasaki without hydrogen, because then it becomes quite an issue.
Please pick me up. Yes, because hydrogen is not just pouring in water, it is refined hydrogen. Yes, you can get it in very few places. Mark Soons, we were just talking about that. Are you going to drive electric, go back to fuel, or switch to hydrogen? Well, near Eindhoven, where we both live, you have quite a few options. But yes, after that, you have to return to Eindhoven.
And then your hydrogen is depleted. In 2009, I had an electric car. Yes, then I spent 3/4 of my time finding an electric charging point, but also lost 3/4 of my energy driving back home. Yes, that doesn't work. And hydrogen always remains challenging because you have an extremely high loss. Batteries only have a 20% loss, 15%, and they are becoming increasingly efficient. Hydrogen still has a 50% loss. However, you can, of course, store it and transport it easily in an intermediate manner. Transporting is also becoming easier, no longer under pressure, but with material. So then you just get the material in which you store it, a kind of fine mesh material, nanomaterials, but it remains an issue. It is 50% loss, and I'm involved through a venture capital company that I once helped set up, Contrarian Ventures, in energy tech. There is also an H2 Pro. An H2 Pro has a VTAC. We haven't really found another way to avoid losing it. And yes, they reach 42, 43%, but still it's more than half loss. So that remains an issue. And the whole story with natural gas, you can simply also pump hydrogen through the same pipes as natural gas. That's not going to work, is it, friend?
That's very interesting, because I spoke to an entrepreneur in Rotterdam who has his business opposite the steelworks in IJmuiden. And he makes pipes, he makes tubes for gases and all different materials. And of course, that requires special coatings and a special treatment to make the pipe for what needs to go through it. What I found remarkable, what he told me this week, is we want to expand. There is enormous growth for these kinds of materials, but in the Netherlands, that's just not possible. We have the space next to our building, we can double in size, we can get the permit, but we have to wait 10 years for our energy connection before there is enough energy for us to expand. They are going to other countries. And that might be a nice segue into what we are currently engaged in globally. Now, of course, it's reshoring. Where are we going to produce? If you don't provide the facilities to produce, where do we start then? Isn't it crazy to think that here, such a man, such an engineer who has really built a very beautiful company, does not get the opportunity to further develop here, but is actually forced to look at another country. And now that's South America, Africa, well, more South America, because at least there is more work ethic than in Africa, is the idea. Then you see the shift there, and it's absurd. I also came across an article about the number of Chinese manufacturers looking towards South America. Yes, you can just see it shifting and not at all what that politics has as a utopia. Oh, we're going back here again. To produce, well, that's just not happening. Yes, that is quite concerning.
Yes, but if you just look at the deep level, that's also because they have made choices to do much more central generation and central distribution. All the experts say you have to go decentralized. You just have to do it at the neighborhood level. There's a wonderful interview about Elon Musk, how he set up Grok in 10 months with the data center in Memphis. Yes, how that guy thinks. Yes, I just find that remarkable for the first time. We need a factory hall first. Well, we found that we need 250 megawatts of capacity there. So we'll just put diesel generators there. Can't do anything about it, but it has to be done. Those 10,000 GPUs need cooling. We'll place them on the other side of the factory and put megawatt cooling there, and then we connect it. Of course, that won't work. So we'll have to add 500 megawatt batteries there, and then it works. And we also need to think decentrally in neighborhoods and cities. It doesn't make any sense, of course. Even in North Holland, we've recently moved to Flevoland. Yes, there are just waiting times for it. I want a charging station. Yes, that's not possible, sir. Sorry, that's not possible. But then I'm a manufacturer or a producer. Yes, that's not possible. Only in 10 years. I say, yes, that's completely impossible. That's absolute nonsense, but we just need to think decentrally. It's just a factory hall a few meters away. It simply has dozens of megawatts of solar panels on its roof. Yes, and then it feeds back into the central system, which goes back to Amsterdam. Crazy. Yes, but that's also absolute. It just has to be local. Yes.
Absurd right now, but that's really a problem because feeding back isn't possible either because we simply don't have a grid for it. That's also a problem because we're literally being offered solar panel parks for take it over for €1 and you bear the cost further. Currently, that market is complete.
While those solar panels, if you connect them to a local-to-local grid with a capacity value in between, you've just solved the problem. Only is there legislation? Yes, that's not allowed because you're not allowed to be a manufacturer of energy. Let's be honest, 70% of energy costs are taxes and distribution, but that eats away at it. Meanwhile, you have no choice. We really need to step on the gas there because otherwise we'll be left behind. But anyway, you've experienced that before.
Maybe you've seen this meme featuring a Chinese.
Fantastic, beautiful Americans.
Amazing, right? Yes, this is what you're wishing for.
I also found it very striking. But aside from the fact that these are obviously distressing working conditions, it's also quite nice, hypocritical with each other. Beautiful, sure, we wish everyone the world, but in the meantime, we buy a product for 50 cents from China, which are simply made in sweatshops, also in oppressed regions. But this is indeed a beautiful example of, yes, enjoy that production. Yes, that was it again. We've talked about it before, acting tough at 50%, and now it's all going back to 10%. That's something, again, exemplary.
I found it an absurd week to jump in on that. Of course, and especially towards China, 104% on China. China came back with 84% on the US in terms of tariff. Then China said, the CCP's minister said, it is arrogant and bullying by America, and we are going to file complaints with the World Trade Organization. Well, that's exactly what China did. And then the US Treasury Secretary says, Barron says that maybe Chinese stocks should be delisted from the American Stock Exchange. Then China says, well, let's reduce our US dollar reserves. And they sell 50 billion in US Treasury bonds. That alone, of course, causes those interest rates, which Trump wants to lower, not to do what he expected them to do. Well, I think that's a short-term effect. Then China goes on to say, well, we've started to respect those IP rights a bit. We shouldn't just copy everything, and we also don't want you to copy everything from us. So let's respect that worldwide. They have said over the past 20 years, well, that is now also in doubt. They say, well, we might not respect all IP rights anymore. That naturally does a lot for American companies because they are really built on that. Well, then the US goes even harder. The tariff goes up to 125% on products from China. And then if you look at what actually America imports from China and China from America, and then I found this quite interesting. Soybeans are the largest product that China imports from the US. They import them to China for 440 million pigs. At the same time, the largest product that America imports from China is smartphones for 232 million Americans. Well, I thought that was quite an interesting comparison. You would have expected that in this chaos, we would all compare pigs with Americans. But still, it's possible.
There was an interesting video by Ray Dalio. I don't know if you know Ray Dalio, a well-known American.
Cripps Waters Associates?
Exactly. Indeed, it embodies the principle that it has a variety of management styles, decentralized thinking, and similar concepts. I find it to be quite a remarkable man to follow. And he also developed an impressive video about the development of the world powers.
But I also have the books.
Definitely read them. And it was, of course, also done in a beautiful graphic design about where the world powers were heading. And that just actually, again, just like last week, space also comes back as a kind of recurring theme. And he illustrated it beautifully that ultimately America is also at the end of its world power. and is being challenged. And whether China will be the next one remains to be seen. But they certainly hold all the cards. And of course, the Netherlands was once one of them in the 15th and 16th centuries. And the British followed, then the Americans, and probably now China. But of course, China is naturally a threat to many people, while it is indeed the oldest world power in the world.
Yes, but two things he beautifully outlined, also in the book he wrote, The New World Order. One thing is that he has been to China many times, so he has been able to see firsthand what the culture in China is like. He also lived there for a while. He explained the New World Orders so beautifully. But what I found so beautiful is that he also describes in the book that there would be a trade war between China and the US. Other countries, BRICS countries, would mainly get involved with that, and that there is a kind of division coming, so that there will be multiple New World Orders and not just one. So he also sees that split, which I think I talked about in episode 4. I'm just a student of economics, but I also see those kinds of things reappearing, those patterns.
Yes, history rhymes, history repeats, but that's not it.
But it isn't fun to follow him because of his principles. I often work principle-based in companies where I get to observe, and those I set up myself. It's very valuable to work with systems and principles. He's really a master at it. But you see that it just works out. He was a bit early in predicting when it would happen. He thought it would happen after COVID. You notice now that with Trump the double down is going to come out. Very interesting. And he also says that an energy crisis is coming. You hear that now. You hear us talking about how actually all problems can be traced back to energy supplies.
Always, right? I think we talked about it last week, how ultimately Japan went to war with China over the fact that they were no longer getting oil. If you look back at every war, almost every war can be traced back to energy. Now that energy demand is much greater, perhaps proportionally the same relative to the population of the countries back then. But when energy is scarce, countries start making strange moves. That is certainly a concern for the coming time.
Certainly, but fortunately, we are also seeing more and more development in that technology. The nanomaterials, you already have certain vessels, certain technology that you can simply throw into a vessel. You throw in your lubricating water, whatever you can imagine, throw it in. I have seen some wonderful examples of fully automated water purification installations based on solar panels right in the bush of Africa.
Just seeing what my little water filter that cleans the entire household water can do is quite amazing. Nanoparticles.
That's why we often discount innovation too much. I think we also saw that during the energy crisis in Europe. That naturally started a bit when we had to move away from Russian gas. Perhaps the exact moment was the blowing up of Nord Stream 2. That was really the trigger for us to take action. Perhaps also a wake-up call. The speed with which we then started building terminals for American gas. If we had to do that at a normal pace with regular permit processes, it would have taken us 20 years. And suddenly they were there in a year and a half. That's a kind of innovation. That might even be bureaucratic innovation, but a lot is possible when the pressure is on. And when the pressure isn't on, it's also very difficult.
I think innovation is wonderful, but as long as the legislation doesn't allow it, innovation always gets stuck in execution. As you rightly say, something always needs to happen. That's human behavior anyway. There must first be enough pain before we take action. But that applies to governments too. They all just keep sticking to the rules until it starts to crack and tear, and then they throw it wide open all at once, and then innovation can take its course. We were just talking about how the government is suddenly going to have defense. ESG, ESG, ESG. We need to read ESG a little differently, and now suddenly it is possible. And I think that's beautiful. You'll see the same thing with energy soon. With energy, it will soon be that all those companies will have to stay on their own continent because we don't want to lose them to South America. Then they'll have to do something with the power grid. They'll have to change the legislation so that people can share with each other and still be taxed on it. Because that's really what it's all about. Yes, I always think it has to crack and tear, and then something will come of it.
Legislation is a social consensus that is documented, with a process around it that makes it difficult to change quickly. That's all it is. It is certainly not a law of nature. We have those too, but they are much more fixed than the laws of a country. That's how it works in a democracy. In a dictatorial leadership, a law is not presented as a social collective, and that is the big difference. It also means it can be more decisive. It also means it can be authoritarian and one-sided. Yes, those laws, if they are built on a social foundation, then it indeed means that the majority must experience discomfort for something to change. And then you also need to have a solution that when consensus is carried as the road of least resistance, and if you don't have those elements, then nothing changes and you generally get stuck in that pain. And you see that, for example, in the housing market, you see that in several other areas as
What
well.
I always find interesting is how much pain there must be for how many people before something is going to change. I always find that tipping point so interesting to keep an eye on. In the housing market, you see, yes, as long as only a few private investors are affected, we won't change much. We'll just push the legislation through. But as soon as the rental market completely stalls, prices only continue to rise. So actually, as soon as you see that a critical mass, but how many people is that, complains loudly enough, then they will look into whether we can reverse or modify it.
And that's why I'm also very interested in Trump's whole approach, because he essentially throws out many of those regulators and rules to let the market dictate much more, whether that's good or not. We've seen in the past that it can also go the wrong way. But you can set frameworks within which people can operate instead of, well, restricting them. Guys, this is the area where we can act, and let's go, because innovation always outpaces legislation by definition. And we just need to make sure that innovation isn't restricted, because many of the problems we have now, even in energy, the solutions are already there. And that's not a problem. But it can't happen because it's not allowed, because there's a rule that prohibits it. Yes, then I think, guys, come on.
And there are great examples of legislation that were completely fixated on current solutions. Quite well known, in New York, legislation was created regarding horses in the city, because research showed that this was in the 1900s, 1920, if they looked 20 years into the future, the streets of New York would be covered with 1 to 2 meters of horse manure. It never happened because, of course, other solutions quickly emerged. Ford came with the car. There were even electric cars being produced back then. Only the product market fit was misjudged. It focused on women. Very beautiful things inside. I don't know if you've ever seen them.
I once sat in the first electric car.
Very beautiful interior, place for flowers. Only there was no man who wanted to buy a woman's car. And the man made the decision about which car was bought. And the woman actually preferred that car because the alternatives were less clean, less tidy.
More exhausts. Guests are annoyed by the noise. Electric cars are tidier.
Indeed, Soons, it's quite fascinating to revisit what you just mentioned. What specific issue are you truly addressing? What is the underlying pain? The pain at that time wasn't focused on stopping exhaust emissions. It was far more related to a male ego. This had to be addressed, therefore decisions are made in a specific manner. I still find it utterly absurd what we are currently witnessing. The sheer number of left-wing parties that are now fully committed to policy, which I believe is in stark contrast to their environmental policies over the last 2 decades. However, this is purely motivated by a desire for protection and, yes, other freedoms, yes, protecting their core freedoms that align with their policies fit. Regardless of any opinion, I find it somewhat hypocritical to then say, we are going to focus fully on defense, conduct military exercises. Turkey is not present today because of a major military drill happening in Germany. This involves the emission of thousands of liters of kerosene, gasoline, and diesel into the environment. I wonder if you've seen that in the Netherlands, another section of heathland has been burned due to a necessary exercise by the defense. You don't hear about these kinds of things anymore when it comes to the left.
Then you come back to the well-known Maslow's pyramid. The base of the pyramid is safety, security, and we base all our principles on that to uphold them.
Yes, we go very far in that.
But anyway, maybe defense should also buy more of those Kawasaki's. Yes, those mountain goats. The mountain goats on hydrogen, I would actually find it a nice photo opportunity of Dirk on such a hydrogen mountain goat.
Yes, I think that would be fun too, especially if he just runs out of hydrogen, to see that look. Of course, we have 3 hydrogen stations. If you then have to go to Germany, a little beach somewhere near Berlin.
Yes, somewhere in the middle on a heath, which just happens to be set on fire by defense.
Modern warfare.
Yes, that might be.
Yes, nice. Well, okay, all these movements are causing quite a bit of chaos on the stock market. Lately, we have seen the strongest decline since 2008. Yes, we have seen the highest rise again. They resemble flash crashes after 2008. COVID caused a kind of flash crash. Basically, it's another flash crash. This is due to Trump saying there will be a 90-day pause on tariffs. It's a very distinctive method of negotiation. On the flip side, in a corporate setting, you might also negotiate this way. And then you throw some things overboard. But in geopolitics, we are just not used to this. And well, the stock market, it goes in all directions, very volatile, and you hear everything again.
Yes, it's true. We have already discussed that man's operational methods a few times. Those who were aware had already stepped out, for instance, a Mr. Buffett, but ultimately he just took everything out and has a lot of cash on hand, and he is going to shop cheaply again soon. That's how he got to where he is, of course. If you had used your brain a bit, You would have anticipated this. The figures remain good, but it's a whole different story. People assume we'll encounter it in 2008, but the actual figures are quite different. Then everyone dives in, running after each other like sheep, and I still find that fascinating. It's interesting how it operates.
Hasn't bought anything, right? No, he can't know. He thinks there's another one coming. So that means something again, right?
The 20th is on its way. Yes, but there's another element to consider, and that's that Buffett is naturally older, significantly older, and he said he barely had a chance to benefit from the flash crash, the COVID flash crash, because it was so fast. It went up so fast again that he really had no time to choose positions. You see that again now, even though, how much have we really dropped? 18%, and now we're up again. A flash crash like that is naturally quite hard to deal with. I believe we will continue to go lower as we have a target in mind, or at least that's my perspective, since that's what Trump explicitly states his aim is. Overall, there's a lot of clutter and noise surrounding it, yet he frequently follows through on his words. At least that's his objective, and he tries to achieve that, which is to bring it down of the interest rates on state bonds. It's not true now. They're up. The 10-year government bonds are up again. Well, that's a short-term effect. If you ask me, they will need to go further down. And if you push the stock market down further, you also force the short-term interest rates to decrease. And I still believe that his true aim is to lower those rates because
they must wrap up the news before this year concludes, correct? A substantial segment is approaching its end. The next 6 months. Then you'll pretty much know what's going to happen. And I think that what he's done now with that 10% towards Europe, he will continue to raise a counter towards China. And when other parties also start to align with China, he will raise the import tariffs in the same way. And I think he will level out a bit this way and wait until the interest rates indeed go down. And then he will simply take his chance to refinance everything.
And that will have to happen because if you look at the national debts and the interest they have to pay on those debts, they are larger than the defense budget, even larger than Obamacare. How are you going to finance that? It's a bit like running a business where you have to pay back more to your creditors than you earn in revenue. And we all know that's not a sustainable situation. And of course, we can go a bit further because it's not certain how much debt you can sustain relative to your gross domestic product, which can still be much higher than it is now.
Greece remains alive. At its highest point, it had a staggering 220% debt in relation to its gross national product. This means that its total debt was equivalent to 2 times. Yes, just 2 times the entirety of its economy. They have made quite a bit of headway on that. I think America is now roughly 110 to 120.
Yes, that's something like it. Well, I still find it somewhat comparable to Japan, which also has a massive national debt. They have significantly higher debts, and their economy is quite stagnant. But in the years after that, the Americans imposed a 100% tariff on Japan. All TVs and similar products came from Japan. A few years later, they experienced a significant recession with the oil and everything else, because Japan was really the production country back then. It has now become China, along with other countries, because it's not just China, it's actually the whole Asian region and South America that manufactures for America. At least, looking back in time, those tariffs really only functioned in one phase. The Second World War, when everyone relied on America, since America was the only continent where the war had not been fought, but was completely focused on production for the war industry. Currently, we lack that. The entire dynamic has transformed, which is indeed frightening when viewed from this perspective, that those rates might actually lead to the effect that they fall into a deeper crisis than they wish to. For those interest rates, because yes, you indeed want to lower those rates, then you will have to bring down the stock market. But right now, in my opinion, they are shouting a bit too loudly, because the moment they go overboard, then it will rapidly go downhill. What I truly find challenging is that Trump is learning that by simply saying, oh, an 8-second pause, everything rises again, and he believes he has it under control. However, there will be a time when he won't have it under control, as it's very precarious.
I think he now believes he is God and can control the entire economy. There is a danger in that, I totally agree, because then you get a fluctuating economy with all those sudden crashes. Oh yes, oh no, not again. Let's add more. Oh no, let's hold off for a moment. At some point, the market also reaches its limit. It then opts for a different route, which is often driven by panic, and not from we are very relaxed and we are ignoring Mr. Trump for a moment. Then it can suddenly drop significantly.
I need to check for a moment. Japan is at 258%. America is at 120%. Greece is at 182% after the debt situation.
Absolutely. One thing I consider to be a truly remarkable dynamic is that the Democrats in the United States have consistently been the party of the working and middle classes. If we take a moment to reflect on Biden and Obama, it's evident that they were very much in favor of promoting the stock market, mainly because their target audience was aging and approaching retirement, heavily invested in their assets, in their stocks. Trump is really conducting a massive wealth transfer from the ultra-rich to the middle class once more. And you almost see an inverted dynamic where Republicans are actually doing more for the middle class than Democrats ever said they would. In simple terms, when we analyze effectively, it has never resulted in wealth, a transfer of wealth from the ultra-rich to the middle class. You can see some of that happening now as the policies aren't really based on, oh well, the richest are getting richer. Actually, if you examine that list, everyone has seen their wealth decline since Trump became president. Now everyone is crying out in outrage because this is unacceptable. I think this is quite a remarkable dynamic.
Well, I thought that regardless. During Trump's election, the whole middle class, the impoverished from the middle class, ultimately turned into Trump supporters. This is certainly a classic example of flipping an entire narrative that has been observed, that the Democrats have shifted entirely to the elite, and the Trump supporters are from the lower and middle class. That is indeed very nice to see. That is, of course, almost impossible in the Netherlands, but in America, we have learned that anything is possible.
But can we expect the same trend in Europe? I mean, you've seen Le Pen, of course, who was convicted for the utilization of European financial resources, as all French parties do. But let's move on. Utilizing EU funds for purposes other than those intended and now being unable to take part in the presidential elections in the country of France does indeed have a massive middle class, though, that follows her. We must consider, for Europe, of course, that the Netherlands is not very relevant to the entire European political climate. However, if we examine France, you see a movement in that direction. So when you look at Germany, you also see a movement in that direction. Can we expect a similar situation here?
Yes, but that has always been the case. This has always been the case in Europe. But in America, it is particularly striking that the Republican Party, which traditionally represents the wealthy conservatives, has completely flipped. And if you observe Germany, along with the Netherlands and France, where far-right voters are located, yes, they represent certain economic classes. I don't know if you've seen the picture of Germany with the election results. It's almost a beautiful map, red and blue, and everything was blue. East Germany, yes, you see those walls, almost the walls. A beautiful picture of the walls back. Yes, almost all former Eastern European municipalities voted for the far right. So yes, this has been going on for a very long time. And yes, that is, of course, understandable. People who are struggling tend to blame other forces for their misery, whether that is justified or not. So I will leave that open for now. I always look at myself first.
Isn't this simply a history that is currently repeating itself once again?
Yes, I think the far right used to originate from southern Germany, Austria. I don't know. That's always the human pendulum. It swings from left to right every time. And that's the case in Europe too. And that is also connected to emigration and refugees. I remember that story well, a beautiful story. Of course, World War I in your region, where various Belgians were taken in because they were fleeing World War I. Ultimately, they were expelled from the country once more, as they had had enough of those Belgians. Break time, they were also considered inferior in the southern part. In my opinion, that remains a significant issue in the history of both nations, except for 100 years prior. But it is also a beautiful example. At one point, Belgians were also spat out in the 1920s because they flooded all of Brabant and Limburg after the war or during the war, the First World War, and you always get extremes, whether it has a color or not. Always when you mix one substance with another, you always get a chemical reaction.
Also, if you go back further, this is how we started with the VOC. It was Napoleon, I believe, who conquered Antwerp. And he said to the market traders, that free trade, you can still do a bit, but you have to leave here. You get 2 years too.
I think it was the Spaniards, right? I thought Napoleon came back only after that. I believe it was the Spaniards. The Spaniards. They were the ones who said, it's our religion or nothing. Jews and artists escaped from Antwerp at that time, heading to Amsterdam. This has truly been the foundation of the city, stemming from the Golden Age. Absolutely. Concerning the initiators, there are 2 official hands directed at Antwerp. That's right, yes. And let's not overlook innovation. My former office was at the Marine Grounds. This past March marked the first time in history the replicas of a VOC ship, a Portuguese ship, and a Spanish ship from that period were all together. What many don't realize is that real innovation, the Dutch had a windmill. Eventually, someone transformed a circular motion into a vertical one, and they could saw an entire tree in one piece, cut wood. This allowed us to construct much bigger ships. I once came across a beautiful story about it, but then I saw the outcome. I also read a story about Portuguese during an invasion on the little island and suddenly saw a Dutch ship coming in. Holy crap, this is a big ship. Now I saw them next to each other. I took a picture of it. And then you really think, holy shit, that ship is huge. You have a Portuguese ship, a Spanish ship, and an enormous Dutch ship lying next to it. Thanks to innovation, we could saw long trees in one piece. In the end, that's the reason we could manage much bigger ships, much more cargo. It meant that the Spaniards and Portuguese had absolutely no chance to compete with us. We could fit 20 times more in the same ship.
That is also a bit of the red thread of this podcast, perhaps. So we really need to focus more on innovation. We must have more faith in innovation, because if we revert to, okay, this is what we have, and that is essentially protectionism. Without innovation, we will just end up very stuck.
The Netherlands could never have become the Netherlands without innovation. VOC is due to innovation. We've been able to build the entire country based on innovation. We are a worldwide innovation nation, and we are increasingly losing that. Over the past months and quarters, investment in innovation has reached an all-time low compared to the last 20 years. If this trend persists, we will genuinely lose the competition. We have far too little funding available for innovation. Mind you, innovation is about trying and failing. It's not a one-off attempt. I didn't invent it. I tried thousands of times at what didn't work, and it clicked. There are numerous instances of innovation that have failed. Yet after trying a second, third, fourth, or fifth time, success can occur. And we really need to embrace that much more here in the Netherlands, also in Europe, but especially in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands has always been an innovative country. Please let's invest more money and time in that to assist entrepreneurs from universities test and validate in the market and launch them into the market. I cannot stress this enough. The Netherlands heavily relies on innovation.
And that means, at least I strongly believe this, that you really need to adopt a different way of thinking from a government perspective, from indeed an educational perspective, but also from an entrepreneurial Dutch perspective, and maybe even the most significant, from a media perspective, because now it is literally true. Above the mowing field, the mower is going over it. If you create something beautiful, it will likely be seen as wrong. That's the initial thought. We prioritize gear and gore over any average entrepreneur.
There has been an incident with Lightyear and Van Moof. They are quickly scrutinized for all their mistakes. But in the meantime, the market truly recognizes the innovation they have implemented and is currently taking advantage of it. But if we look back at history, the one who invented the first mill and could saw vertically was also laughed at and, I believe, set on fire. So that might be a little ingrained in the Dutch over the years, but we should learn better from history.
Yes, I agree. I believe that entrepreneurship is always about swimming against the tide. Therefore, we should do a bit more and hope a bit less for better circumstances. I think part of the answer lies there. I doubt they were considering government intervention during the VOC period to modify laws and regulations or expecting additional subsidies. I also see a role for ourselves as entrepreneurs and as supporters of entrepreneurs. While innovation is fantastic, it often requires going against the tide. Challenging the consensus and facing resistance fosters growth, and we need to continue to explore that topic.
One of my favorite quotes has always been, if credible people think I'm crazy, then I start a project. And I always find that beautiful. The harder it gets, the more my tail starts to wag. Many entrepreneurs feel the same way. Luckily, we still have individuals who persist in advocating for such agendas, despite the strict legislation, very strict about it.
And that reminds me of another quote that was always shared with me, which was, we really lived in a world where you have one expert and that's final. I was told, if an expert says it can't be done, look for another. Many people exist in the world, and they can all do amazing things. An expert, often self-proclaimed, is not always the end of the line. It's a bit of a dead-end street, and then back again, and back and forth on the main street, until you find another who says, well, maybe it can work if we look at it this way.
And I always say, the only way to know is to try. Let's try. I will never tell a business owner it's impossible.
Look, the most beautiful things are built by going against the current. That's how cars came to be. That's how we discovered electricity, and that's how computers were invented. I always find it quite beautiful. We can find all sorts of reasons why others want to hinder you, but it's precisely that is what drives growth.
That's also the right motivation for many people.
That's why a crisis is so interesting, guys. The current is unpredictable, so you're quickly swimming against it. There are countless studies that say the best companies are built during a crisis, while good times are often just ballast. Many companies aren't that useful because they only function when times are good. So this is actually the most beautiful period, and I found that so lovely. Westling also elaborated on this for us yesterday. What his company does exactly and what he is working on. What exactly does his fund do? No fund, a cooperative, an investment cooperative.
The term fund is included, isn't it? It's an official investment corporation, so we can't refer to ourselves as a fund. We don't think that's cool either. It's basically the Berkshire Hathaway by the Amstel, because it's structured like a permanent capital vehicle. Because Mr. Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway also grew large by buying Apple shares early and holding them for 30 years. And that's what we had to do.
Sure, but we also embrace innovation and create wonderful companies. And I truly believe that now is the right time for it. Of course, we saw mega multiples in 2020 for companies that sometimes made us scratch our heads about what the real use case was.
Gorillas, sledge delivery.
Now you have to, of course. Now you can't just get away with Walt Disney stories. You need something concrete now, otherwise you won't get capital released. That's one to build on. Second, you have a market that is looking a bit more critically now and is no longer ordering toys for the business, but instead wants to order tools for the business.
Some problems are genuinely worth the effort to solve, rather than just delivering one banana on a scooter for 10 minutes. I believe there are numerous issues that require solutions. This is true not only in the Netherlands, but also around the globe. We should invest much more dedicated time and targeted resources into these challenges.
Well, nice wrap up. I think that's a good ending for this week. I think there's a very important message in this podcast, intended or not, very much intended, but not planned. Let's all support innovation. This week, of course, thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. And I've heard from many that they don't always catch that we're back. So also enable notification bell for the podcast. You'll be notified weekly when we're back online. Every Friday at 10 o'clock, we are online again to review the previous week, look forward and recognize innovation, to examine the markets and to see where the opportunities lie for the upcoming period. I want to sincerely thank you all this week and see you next time. Until next time.